So good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome once again to this webinar. So we are MedGenome, the leaders in genetic testing in India. And the topic for today's webinar is the genetic etiology of recurrent pregnancy loss. Our speaker for today is Dr. Meenakshi Lallar, consultant clinical geneticist at MedGenome. Meenakshi Lallar did a residency in OBGYN and DM in medical genetics from SGPGI Lucknow. Formerly, she was associate consultant at Institute for Medical Genetics and Genomics, Sir Gangaram Hospital, New Delhi. Her field of interests are in reproductive genetics, prenatal diagnosis, and molecular genetics. In addition to Dr. Lalla, we also have Dr. Sheetal Sharda, Senior Consultant Clinical Geneticist at MedGenome Labs, who will pitch in with their insights at the end of the talk. So without any further delay, I will now transfer the host to Dr. Meenakshi, who will take this webinar forward.
A very good afternoon, everyone. So starting on with today's topic, I'm Dr. Meenakshi, and I'm a consultant geneticist with MedGenome Labs. And today's topic is a very interesting one, the genetic etiology of the recurrent pregnancy loss. It is one which is constantly evolving with the newer input from the genetic technology that we have as of now. So just starting off with the framework, how are we going to go about in this talk? So we'll start in from the definition, and then we'll go through the genetic etiology in the both the couple and the conceptors. We will discuss the different testing options and case scenarios. Then we'll address some controversies in dilemmas, and then we'll go on to the diagnostic and management options, how we are going to summarize this. Starting off with definition, so we know that if 100 women are pregnant, around 10 to 15% will have a clinically recognized pregnancy that will be miscarried, will be lost. And around more than one will have more than one pregnancy is lost in 5% of women, and 1 to 2% of these women out of 100 will experience more than 2 pregnancy losses. Now, different bodies have different definitions that they give, like the UK RCOG, we are all very familiar with, and the various European bodies say that the loss of 3 or more consecutive pregnancies is recurrent pregnancy loss, and they also include the biochemical pregnancies, while the 2 largest bodies, ESHRE and ASRM, the European and the American respectively, say it's more than 2 pregnancies. Actually, this is based on a large study involving more than 1,000 participants. They say that if you investigate after 2 pregnancy losses or 3 pregnancy losses, the output is equivalent. So why to give the agony of waiting for another pregnancy loss, especially in today's scenario where the reproductive age is increasing? So better to start after 2 recurrent losses. Now, there are 3 more subdivisions of RPL: primary, secondary, and tertiary. So primary is when there is all miscarriages, no viable pregnancy. Secondary is multiple losses, but then she has then the woman has a viable pregnancy or a IUD after 20 weeks, so she crosses the age of viability with one of her pregnancies. And tertiary RPL is when there are interspersed losses in between the different miscarriages. Okay, the RPL etiology, as we see that in the known segment, the most important ones are the anatomic factors, the autoimmune factors, which is mostly the APLA, the antiphospholipid syndrome, then infections, endocrine factors, genetic factors form 2 to 5% of this, and the unexplained, including the inherited thrombophilias, a very little score of it. The unidentified ones are 40 to 50%. And I think as we have more insight into genetics, the genetics is going to occupy a major chunk of this in the coming years, as we'll discuss in the forthcoming slides with the newer technologies. So this was a very nice study by Jaslow et al. In 2010, and they studied 1,020 patients with recurrent pregnancy losses. And as we can see, in more than 3 pregnancy losses, genetics contributed to 5%, anatomy to 18%, the lupus anticoagulant and anticardiolipin 2 and 13%. And the thrombophilia factors were less, 8.1 factor 5. As we'll discuss subsequently, we don't know actually we don't have evidence based how to really investigate them or not. So now coming on to the second section that we are going to discuss, genetic etiology testing options and case scenarios in the couples with recurrent pregnancy loss. So if we have a cohort of couple with recurrent pregnancy losses, that cohort is going to have a background chromosomal abnormality rate of 2 to 9% as compared to 0.7% in the general population. So we see that here the abnormality chromosomes is much higher than the general population, and the larger chunk of it is formed by the balanced reciprocal translocations, as we all know, by the Robertsonian translocations between the two acrocentric chromosomes, the small supernumerary markers, some mosaicism around 4%, inversions, the pericentric and the paracentric ones, microdeletions form a small part. And this 25% that I've mentioned is the other chromosomal variants. This seems a large chunk, but actually, 46%, the other chromosomal variant seems a large chunk, but it is the heteromorphisms, the normal chromosome heteromorphisms that we see on a karyotype, like those central increased heterochromatin in 1, 16, 9, all those type of variants, which have been seen to occur at a slightly higher prevalence than the general population in the infertile and the recurrent pregnancy loss couples. This is a diagram which shows these, which represents as a picture these malformation is here is the Robertsonian translocation, where you can see that an acrocentric chromosome goes and attaches to another acrocentric, and so there is two chromosomes become one. So, and the reciprocal translocation is when the exchange occurs between non-acrocentric chromosomes. So there can be a pericentric inversion around involving the centromere, a paracentric away from the centromere, and then there are the small interstitial and the terminal deletions, microdeletions, that can also be causative. Now, taking a case scenario, so this woman, she came to us for preconceptional counseling. She had a history, she's not pregnant when she came to us. She had a miscarriage at 10 weeks, again at 10 weeks, and the last miscarriage was at 12 weeks, and there was increased NT that was seen in the last miscarriage. So we advised her that she should go for the routine recurrent pregnancy loss workup. Because I'm talking on the genetic aspect, I would highlight on my part. So a karyotype was advised. And what was the reports? The husband had a normal karyotype, whereas the wife had a translocation between chromosome 51 and 21. So if we see here, the 121 has translocated here to the 51. So the total in the wife remains the same. There's a 21, there's a 21. That remains the same, but the gametogenesis is going to be affected. There will be unbalanced gametes. So when we had the results, we had a preconceptional counseling session, and we explained that now we can offer her 3 strategies. Either she can go expectant management, like she should conceive and she should come to us for a prenatal diagnosis. We explained both the scenarios, a CVS or amniocentesis. We would prefer amniocentesis because of the lesser pregnancy losses, and because if it's very lethal, they might miscarry by themselves in early pregnancy. And we know because expected pregnancy outcomes are successful in 60% of these couples. So there's a good prognosis. The second option is PGT-A, like you can explain the pros and the cons. It is actually PGT-A has in various studies, because there are not many meta-analysis, but some studies say it has a good outcome, some studies say it's at par with expectant outcome. So all this information was given to the patient, and the last resort is for a donor ova, because wife has the balanced translocation. So the couple opted for expected management, and the NTNB scan was done at their native place, and it was reported normal. She came to us for amniocentesis at 16 weeks. The scan showed polydactyly, a congenital heart defect. Amniocentesis was done, and the microarray showed trisomy 50. So this is the microarray. It showed, we're going to discuss in forthcoming slides that microarray is the preferred modality now. Now, how did this happen? Because she was a translocation carrier, so this translocation is because there was a translocation. So there are 2 types of segregation that can take place: alternate or adjacent. So if it's alternate, so that results in normal gametes or balanced. This happens around 50 to 60 times. So this results in a normal pregnancy. But what happened in our patient was this adjacent segregation, which led to a trisomy 50. So ultimately they chose a donor ova because due to cost limitations, they could not go for PGT-A. Now coming on to the genetic etiology testing options and case scenarios for the conceptus. By conceptus, I mean the fetus. So we know that for the fetus in early pregnancy losses, autosomal trisomy accounts for 62%. In around 4% of the cases, there can be multiple trisomies. Monosomies are very few, like only 1%. Monosomy X, the Turner syndrome forms a major chunk, 11%, triploidy 12%, tetraploidy 1%, and segmental deletions, duplications, the copy number variations are very few, 4.6%. Now, this newer thing that is coming in is the single gene disorders associated with recurrent pregnancy loss. As of now, we don't have really a percentage that we can give ourselves here because it's very recent development. But with the more input of whole exome sequencing, genome sequencing, I think this should pick up. And now we have a curated database of around 20 genes that are definitely associated with early lethality and recurrent pregnancy losses. Third is polygenic and multifactorial. Thousands and numerous number of studies have been done on the polygenic and multifactorial etiology of reproductive pregnancy losses, where a chunk of genes involving vasculogenesis, angiogenesis, implantation, interleukin cytokines show thrombophilia associated genes have shown a slightly increased odds ratio. And now it is said that these have a cumulative effect, like they will not have a one-to-one Mendelian pattern, but they together will accumulate, and then the threshold will be caused. This will be responsible for a recurrent pregnancy loss. The epigenetic factors, like we'll discuss this in the end, and the very rare and the debatable causes are the X inactivation and confined placental mosaicism. The genetic etiology in conceptus, most important is the chromosomal. So if there's a pre-implantation, pre-embryonic, the embryo is not visible on ultrasound, we can say that 90% is the chance of a chromosomal anomaly. Similarly, less than 10 weeks, it's not available, ultrasound visible. It's visible, but 70% of these have a chromosomal anomaly. And if it's a loss between 10 to 13 weeks, that figure goes a little lesser, 50%, and late fetal is 30%, and stillbirth is 12%, because most of the lethal chromosome ones have been eliminated by the time the fetus grows. And the other factors like the anatomic factors, the APLA and thrombophilia, these factors come into play a little later than the genetic factors. And the other important thing to remember is that though the genetic etiology for a total pregnancy loss is much higher at less than 10 weeks, but there are genetic etiologies which are compatible with survival. So those fetuses are going to be anomalous, and they might be able to continue throughout the pregnancies. So starting off with the fetal aneuploidy, as we all know, that as maternal age increases, the risk of aneuploidy increases. So for a woman who is 20 to 24 years, the spontaneous miscarriage rate is 11%. And similarly, in a woman who's more than 40 years, this rate goes by 51%. It becomes 100 times more likely. So if a woman has recurrent pregnancy losses in the earlier age group, we know that aneuploidy might not be such a big causative factor, but it would be a much causative factor in the older women. Now, the most important thing is the cytogenetic testing of the products of conception. We have evolved from karyotype to FISH to microarray. So in the older times when microarray was not widely available, it was still under in research, we used to do karyotype of the products of conception, and there would be high failure rates as high as 50% and such low poor resolution and culture failures, and we could not, so in most of the cases we could not get any answers. But with the recent microarray technology, especially with the SNP based SNP based microarrays, some of the studies have shown that in around 90% of the pregnancies, I'm talking about the sporadic ones, we can get an answer through the microarrays. So why should we test the products of conception? Because first of all, they're going to tell us if there's a genetic etiology or not. They will tell us the genetic etiology is likely to be de novo and it won't occur again, or is it likely to be inherited and will affect our prognosis for the next pregnancy. So that is how it's going to help us. It will provide us the etiology and the risk of reoccurrence. Now, this is just a sample report. In this, patient had a recurrent pregnancy losses. The POCs were sent, and here we see we see a trisomy of 7 and monosomy X. So this is something very rare, and this is something de novo, so you won't be worried about it occurring again. Secondly, in this patient, there was trisomy 16. Trisomy 16, as we all remember, it's one of the most commonest causes of aneuploidy in early pregnancy losses. So here I won't be worried about as risk of reoccurrence. So this is going to be something very comforting for the parents, that this decreases your risk of having anything in the next pregnancy. Now, what are the advantages of microarray above and over karyotype in fish? The resolution, as we see, is higher for the SNP-based microarrays, and it actually depends upon the platform that you are using. It can further increase. So it's highest among the three. It cannot pick up balanced translocations, which is picked by karyotype, but balanced translocation is certainly not something that would lead to a pregnancy loss. So we're not actually looking for this in products of conception. Mosaicism, it picks up depending upon platform to which degree you can pick it up. It can also, the SNP-based microarray can pick up UPD. It can pick up the parental origin of aneuploidy. It can help us with the maternal contamination, which is very important for accurate results. And the failure rate is very, very low, and which is very high in cases of karyotype. And it is objective. It is bioinformatic objective evaluation. So the chances of error are very, very less. The turnaround time is around 7 to 10 days. And amongst all the three, it is actually the most cost effective. It is a genomic technique with very less chances of failure. So it is the most cost effective out of all the three. So I would just like to share that ACOG in its recent recommendations in 2019 has formulated a committee opinion where it has said that where it has documented the uses of microarrays and NGS in obs and gynae, and there it is specifically mentioned that chromosomal microarray technique can be applied on products of conception, amniotic fluid, placenta in evaluation of IUDs and stillbirths. Now we're talking all about microarray, but just to highlight a newer concept that is coming in, that is the whole genome sequencing in Conceptus for copy number variations. So here what they are doing, they're taking the products of conceptions, but they're not doing a microarray, but they are doing a low depth whole genome sequencing. So, and it has been shown in studies that it has a higher detection than microarray and enhanced mosaicism detection. So this is not as of now for diagnostic purposes, but just to condition you all that maybe in the coming next years, this is something that we move on to. So now coming on to case second. So this is the couple who presented to us with the third miscarriage. The previous miscarriages were at 10-14 weeks. Now she was pregnant with 16 weeks with increased NFT, and it was an IUD. And she was worked up. She was totally worked up because of the 2 pregnancy losses. So APLA, karyotype, TSS, 3D ultrasound, thrombophilia profile, everything was normal. So she miscarried the baby, the POC microarray was sent, and a 3.5 MB interstitial deletion was detected on the X chromosome, and it was an XY fetus. So whenever you have some interstitial deletions like this, then you want to have a look at the parental genomes, because X is inherited from the mother. We looked at her X chromosome with microarray, and she was found to have this large deletion on X long arm 23-27. This was detected. Now, what is the learning point from this case? Their karyotype was obviously normal. So the karyotype could not have picked this 3 MB deletion, because that is much below the resolution of a karyotype. And so this could have gone missed if the POC microarray would not have been done. And as we know, that this actually has a role, because in the next pregnancy you're always going to screen her for that, because she is going to transmit it to her the X chromosome with the deletion to the females as well as the males, and the males don't have another X chromosome, so it's just going to be pathological for them. So the genetic etiology, single gene disorders in the Conceptus. Now as we all know, as I've talked, that literature is coming up since the whole genome sequencing, whole exome sequencing has become so widespread. They have found out by testing on many products of conception, fetuses with parents with recurrent pregnancy losses, they've identified certain genes which are important for the fetal development, like the genes for the various gene expressions for the early development, for inflammation and immune response, because the pregnancy has to be sustained through the placenta. Various genes involved in the microtubules, meiotic cycles, because large number of cell division is going on in the fetal development. So what these studies have said is that that when whole exome sequencing was applied to patients who had recurrent pregnancy losses and normal microarrays, they've identified various vital pathways in the, this all has been done in research settings, and this is going to improve our knowledge of early embryo development, as well as those genes which, if knocked out, are going to be lethal in the humans. So this is going to tell us about the core set of genes which is important for human development, and it is going to tell us that which couples are carrier of these genes, and this is leading to recurrent pregnancy losses in them. So due to this technology, it is said that the 5% contribution of genetic causes is much more likely to increase, and we're more likely to fill that unidentified 50% cohort that we have. And but it is still important to realize that the yield here, like if I subject all the recurrent pregnancy losses couple who have normal microarray of POCs to this testing, everybody is not going to have results. The yield is still low, and we cannot give even a definite figure, because it is still very upcoming thing and the literature is scarce as of now. So this is a meta-analysis which did. So I'm just going to discuss how did they approach whole exome sequencing in the products of conception. So the first approach was that they did trios, like they took the parents and they took the products of conception. This approach is actually the best approach, but the higher costs, obviously, because this approach is going to tell us that if any dominant de novo mutation in some lethal gene is there. Second approach, when only the products of conception DNA was tested by whole exome sequencing, we don't look at the parents due to the problem because cost constraints. Secondly, when POC DNA is not available, you don't have the POC DNA with you, it's gone. So you can do the parental studies. Parents, you can take the parent samples, and then they can undergo whole exome sequencing, and then you can filter out and enrich the genes that you think are important. And lastly, sometimes we do this because of the cost constraints, that we only look at the mother's genes. It is more important for the mother's genes because of the X chromosomes. So if only it's very cost limited, approach is only doing the mothers. So now they compared by different approaches. These authors, by different approaches, they were able to find out different genes involved in different fetal pathways, which were leading to recurrent pregnancy losses in different families. So till now, I've just discussed the strengths of whole exome sequencing, but it's a very challenging technique to do in the products of conception. First of all, the literature, as I've said, is scarce. The yield in early RPL is not well established as of now. The limitation is high cost. If you want to do absolutely the best, you have to go for a trio. And look at the cost. The costs will be very high. Plus, you will not be able to tell the patient that definitely this is the yield. Plus, if you are going for a whole exome sequencing, still there are difficult areas of genomes with multiple repeats, which you will not be able to sequence. Those will not be covered. Plus, you will be having difficulties in those findings. Like you have secondary variants. You don't know how to correlate them with the phenotype. Non-paternity, you might get variants of uncertain significance. And it's very difficult to functionally prove something in a POC variant. The DNA amount is very limited. The functional tissue, where will we get it from? As I discussed, incomplete coverage, and whole exome sequencing only covers the exons, not the known coding areas. And somehow recurrent pregnancy loss has always been seen as something polygenic and multifactorial. So you can never actually correlate the environmental variables with these findings. So these interactions you will not be able to always deny. So this is just example of a report where it was sent in view of a bad obstetric history and recurrent miscarriages in between, something sort of a secondary RPL. And here we got uh, variants of uncertain significance. Now, it is very difficult to know their significance. Then what happens is we would like to sequence the parents. So all this has to be explained in the pre-test counseling sessions, that see, this thing can happen. You can get variants of uncertain significance, and then you have to go back to the parent studies, and this might incur more cost. And this needs to be told. And sometimes we will get none. Like this report, we absolutely got no variant. So this case highlights the power of whole exome sequencing. So this couple had 2 cytogenetically normal miscarriages. So microarray was 2 fetal losses in 10 weeks. Microarray was done normal in both, and the RPL workup was negative. So all the RPL negative, the uterine, anatomic, endocrine, apply, everything was done. Even the thrombophilia was done, because this is under a research study. So now what they did was that they did pre-test genetic counseling. That is very important before any wide-scale genetic test. And a trio whole exome sequencing was done for the couple as well, this POC DNA. And what they found out was that they found a compound heterozygous mutations in DYNC2H1 gene, and the same 2 mutations were found in the previous POC DNA, and segregation was done in the parents, and it was in silico pathologic variations. But the limitation was that you cannot do a functional analysis. And when you look back, DNC2H1 is involved in cilia biogenesis in early fetal development, and it has been associated with phenotypes that are fetally lethal, like asphyxiating thoracic dystrophy, short rib polydactyly syndromes, etc. So so how will you manage now this case? If you find a mutation in both the parents and these are carriers, then same thing. Either you go for expectant, a 25% chance of a pregnancy loss. Secondly, what you do is you go for a PGT. That can be done. The costs are exorbitant. Plus, you really don't know the success rates vary. There are different studies that quote different results. And the third is then that we tell them, okay, one of the go for a donor sperm or a donor ova, or lastly adoption. So this is a very complex issue, and a genetic counseling session before such complex testing is a must. Now coming on to the controversies and dilemmas that we have in recurrent pregnancy loss. First of all, inherited thrombophilia genetic testing. So we know that thrombophilias can be inherited or acquired. Acquired thrombophilia is APLA, which is also antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, which is also an immunologic cause of pregnancy. And that has a well-established role in 15 to 20% of the patients with recurrent pregnancy loss. That yes, that is causative. You start the heparin, you start aspirin, and those patients will have a 50% reduction in pregnancy losses. But as for the inherited thrombophilias, which are the factor V Leiden mutation, prothrombin gene mutation, protein C deficiency, protein S deficiency, antithrombin deficiency, the early study, there was a very good article from Lancet that said that these genes have an increased odds ratio risk. But the recent studies have not shown any risk or any inherited thrombophilia to be associated with any recurrent pregnancy loss. And a Cochrane review has come up that even if you screen, it should not be screened per se, even if you screen and you start heparin and aspirin, it's not going to be beneficial. So it is not recommended for recurrent pregnancy loss patients to be routinely screened for thrombophilia unless there is a family history of venous thromboembolism, and they should not be given any antithrombotic prophylaxis. Excuse me. Secondly, MTHFR polymorphism and recurrent pregnancy loss. In many times we see that we have polymorphisms coming up in MTHFR gene in our genetic studies. And there are widespread meta-analysis, genetic studies, especially with these two polymorphisms, the C677T and A1298C, which have said, and most of the studies have said that yes, there is a risk which might be early, late to late pregnancy loss risk with these two variants, and mostly in the East Asian population. We have a large North Indian study also, which says that yeah, slightly increased risk is there in homozygous MTHFR polymorphisms, but it is because this leads to this polymorphism reduces the enzyme activity. It leads to hyperhomocystinemia, and then the two substrates become important, folic acid and B12. So as long as you are supplementing these two, this actually doesn't make much of a difference. So the testing has a very limited utility, and it is not advisable to test. This is just to show that in carrier testing, we have carrier testing in MedGenome where we have silver, gold, platinum panels. Where we do carrier testing, we often incur such mutations and quite commonly, and even as a separate test, we incur the common polymorphisms, but not much clinically relevant and actionable. Coming to something very new, sperm DNA fragmentation. What is actually sperm DNA fragmentation? It is measured by DFI, sperm fragmentation index. It means the percentage of sperm out of the total whose DNA has been damaged. So if you look at the sperm DNA, it is very compactly arranged in the sperm, and a little of the DNA is not compact, and it lies in the periphery. So it's not tightly adhered to the chromatin, and sperm DNA damage has been postulated that it is going to lead to increased miscarriages and increased recurrent pregnancy losses, infertility. It's been seen in patients with varicoceles in post-infections. So a large meta-analysis, which I'm quoting, a 2019 study, it has evidence that yes, women with recurrent pregnancy loss, their partners had higher sperm DNA fragmentation. But there are many techniques to test DNA sperm fragmentation. You could have flow cytometry based tunnel techniques. You could have fluorescent microscopy techniques. You could have electrophoresis based techniques. So different techniques, you really don't know how to correlate these studies together. But they say, okay, and some of the newer reviews are actually saying that, okay, you should test every male with it should have a semen analysis and a sperm. A semen analysis should always be done with sperm DNA fragmentation in together, and it should be done. But the main thing that they are doing is that how are you going to treat it? You give antioxidants. If there's a varicocele, you treat it. So unless and until you have a robust treatment for this thing, the society says that in clinics it should not be tested as of now. So the effect, we do not actually know how do you correct sperm DNA fragmentation by oral antioxidants, microfluidic techniques. So this needs to be addressed too before you take any step and incorporate it as a routine testing. Though it is applauded as useful in infertility, recurrent pregnancy losses by most of the studies. So at present, the screening for it in RPL is not recommended by the American Society of Reproductive Medicine. Now, another dilemma is whether to the patients with recurrent pregnancy losses with balanced translocation should go for IVF with pre-implantation genetic testing or not. So if there's a balance, large studies have been done, and the live birth rate, as you can see in the study that I've quoted, as they have said that it's not significantly different, but yeah, some of the figures do favor the PGT side. It looks promising, especially in the women who are more than 35 years of age. It's a valid approach because the risk of aneuploidy increases. Plus, PGT also helps you in single embryo transfer because that has a good rate. So this is a promising option, but it should always be discussed. Before going on to this, all options should be discussed. And yes, for idiopathic RPL, like there's no genetic cause identified, there's no balanced translocation. For idiopathic RPL, as of now, they say equal rates are there. But yes, maybe for the elderly couples, it could be considered. So, but before giving them this option, everything else should be discovered. They should be told that expectant management does have a good prognosis, 50 to 60%. Even after 3 miscarriages, you have a good chance of expectant management. And the options of a donor egg or sperm, surrogacy, adoption, everything should be discussed in correlation to offering of this PGT. Now, just touching upon the various future topics, epigenetics, a study was done in which it was shown that the maternal pregnancy related diseases like gestational diabetes, PIH, they lead to certain methylation abnormalities in the placenta, and CREB5 was a novel gene. It was identified by genome-wide DNA methylation and RNA sequencing, and it was hypomethylated. And when this gene was hypomethylated, it led to dysfunction of the trophoblast cells and hence a dysfunctioning placenta and recurrent pregnancy loss. So again, by this, I mean to say, I just want to initiate this, that we are slowly progressing towards inclusion of like deciphering more of the lacuna of 50%. Maybe epigenetics plays a role there, right? Now, another interesting thing is low pass genome sequencing. We know that recurrent pregnancy loss couples karyotype has to be done basic, but a recent study was done in which a low pass genome sequencing was done. This means that you are amplifying their genome with a depth of around 5 to 10, and then you are detecting the chromosomal abnormalities in the couple, and this detected this if in the cohort chromosomal abnormalities were detected in 8%, this detected in 11%. So it detected over and above the normal karyotype, especially inversions and a few balanced translocations, small ones which were missed by a routine karyotype. So it was said in this study that if you, by this technique, 9 recurrent out of 9 recurrent miscarriage couples, one had a chromosomal abnormality. As of now, just of research purposes, but you know, everything from this research settings is slowly comes into the clinics. So maybe by this, I just want to share that with advent of time, with advent of genetic research, we are going to have much more answers as of now. In the end, I would like to summarize the diagnostic and management options. So the best genetic workup of recurrent pregnancy loss starts when you have a POC microarray. Always, I would say a POC microarray should be done after a second or a third pregnancy loss. And if a microarray is normal, then depending upon if it's a second or a third, you can go for a couple karyotype, and you have to rule out all the anomalies. Just don't stop at the genetics. We have to rule out anatomic. They constitute 20%, APLA again 20%, endocrinal roughly 5%. And you offer them expectant management, donors, or PGTA. And if somebody is really interested, has had many losses, then after a detailed genetic counseling, whole exome sequencing, which is the yield is really questionable right now, but it will yield answers in some cases. So after explaining pros and cons, it can be done. And if in a POC microarray, you actually found a copy number variation, the yield is different, 70 to 10 to 70%, because a different timing of loss of pregnancy, fetus has anomalies or not. Then you have to look if the parental testing karyotype or microarray is needed, and then you subsequently counsel them for expectant, donor, or PGTA. So here I would like to conclude by saying that genetic factors account for about 5% of recurrent pregnancy loss, and this is going to grow with the newer genetic technologies. And in spite of recurrent pregnancy loss, always we should emphasize that these couples have 50 to 60% chance of a good outcome. The chromosomal etiology is the most important genetic etiology in recurrent pregnancy loss. Couple karyotype and POC microarray are the basic genetic testing to guide management in recurrent pregnancy loss. And single gene etiology and whole exome sequencing is newer, upcoming with limited literature. But if we want to go ahead with it, there should be a detailed pre-test counseling prior to this. So with this, I would like to thank all of you for joining the webinar, and I would like to welcome any questions.
First question is, why recurrent loss of pregnancy in the first trimester?
Recurrent loss of, see, first trimester of the pregnancy is the period of pregnancy where most of it is going on. Like the fetus is forming in that period. There is cleavage, blastocyst, morula formation. The uterine environment is implantation is going on. So all the major processes are involved in the first trimester. So if there is abnormality in any of the processes, it is going to a recurrent pregnancy loss. So lethal genetic, all of it is going to be in the first trimester. So all the genetics, major genetics is going to come here. Then immunological, if there is abnormality in the placental uterine interface, it's going to be here. So, and the thrombophilia and the antiphospholipids, they come a bit later. But most of the recurrent pregnancy losses occur in the first trimester, and 70% are chromosomal. So I would like to say the more earlier the recurrent pregnancy losses, the more of a genetic component. And it is most of it is occurring because this is the time when the fetus is adapting to the uterine environment, and if the fetus is actually fit or viable or not. If not viable, genetic anomaly, it will be miscarried, aborted.
Okay. Is there any role for sending POC for microarray after first miscarriage?
No, I would say after first miscarriage, I would not like to send a POC for microarray. It is not cost effective because, as I said, depending upon the gestation, it is most likely an aneuploid fetus. Depending upon the gestation, the maternal age, all these features, things you have to take in account. Plus, but one condition where I would like to have it studied is when there is a family history of miscarriages on the maternal or the paternal side. So that could tell us beforehand that maybe the couple is a translocation carrier. So only in that situation. Otherwise, for the first miscarriage, I would not prefer a microarray.
Okay. Another question is reasons for no cardiac activity in early pregnancy.
As we've already discussed, in early pregnancy, depending upon the stage, as we discussed, pre-implantation, pre-embryonic, the genetic factors, the chromosomals first, are most important. In the earlier, the more chromosomal, and then as the pregnancy gestation increases, it could be antiphospholipid syndromes, it could be anatomic factors, but the more earlier, the more genetic factors.
Okay. Another question is cytogenetic implications of repeated pregnancy loss. Are there any?
Yes, it was discussed in detail during the talk also. Like around 2 to 9% of the couples with recurrent pregnancy losses have structural chromosomal abnormalities, and 70% of the fetuses who have been miscarried have a chromosomal abnormality. So cytogenetic role is a definite role, and POC microarray after second or third should be sent, and a couple karyotype should be done in recurrent pregnancy loss.
Okay. Another interesting question is it done on request while doing NIPT, or should it be specifically requested for?
So by this question, I understand that you are asking if NIPT was done and NIPT was normal, and now the patient has miscarried after a normal NIPT. Do you need to send that POC for microarray? I think yes, because NIPT will only look at chromosome 21, 13, 18 and the sex chromosomes, and it is most sensitive for 21. Whereas in POC microarray, it's a genomic technique to look at all the chromosomes. And in early pregnancy losses, basically you could have trisomies in the other chromosomes as well. So if NIPT is normal and it's the pregnancy is miscarried, you need to send a POC microarray if it's a second or a third miscarriage, not the first one. So NIPT, if normal, does not mean that everything is normal with all the chromosomes. It's only looking at 21, 13, 18, X and Y, and most sensitive only for 21, 13, 18 lesser, and for the sex chromosomes, 90%. So it should be done after second or third, even after a normal NIPT.
Okay, so we've got a lot of questions on the chat window and the Q&A window. So let me see if I can address all of them to you. So let's just start off with the first one. In case of a balanced translocation of couple, what would you advise?
If a couple has balanced translocation, like one of our cases had, so expectant management I would start with is going to yield us a good result in 60% cases. Secondly, they can go for if they've had multiple failures, they might be emotionally very tragic about it, and they can go for a PGTA that is going to be successful depending upon the it is successful in 60 to 70% they say. And third is we should always discuss the options of a donor ova or donor sperm depending upon the spouse which has this balanced translocation and adoption and all the other choices.
Okay, so we have, okay, so in case of inversion of which chromosome leads to recurrent pregnancy loss?
It depends upon, see, some of the pericentric, first of all, the inversions, there are two types, pericentric and pericentric means involving the centromere, and paracentric. So in paracentric, usually what happens is that these lead to anomalous fetuses, and paracentric ones, they lead to all or none. So it depends upon which chromosome is involved. You cannot pinpoint like which chromosome is involved, because the inversion, it will the different area would be covered. Like it could be a very small inversion around the centromere, and this area around the centromere is usually a repeat region. So if it's a very small inversion, it might not be having any relevant gene. So there are many heteromorphic inversions. But what you have to do is you have to look at the chromosome number, the size of the inversion, before commenting on that. So that needs to be looked
Okay.
at.
So the same person is asking if karyotyping is possible and useful for the fetus.
Because we are discussing pregnancy loss here, karyotype on products of conception is outdated now. We should go for microarray, lesser of culture failure, more yield of results. The turnaround time is quicker. You can have so much. You can have UPD detection. You can have smaller, higher resolution. You have so smaller things can be. So karyotype I would really not encourage. I would say that for products of conception, microarray should be sent. Karyotype can be done. It can be done if there are viable cells, but the utility is limited. When you have microarray, it's always better to go for microarray.
Okay. So the next question is, I have seen mostly clinicians do not rely on TORCH if there is no family history. I think OBGYN should rely on TORCH too. What is your take on an important marker in RPL?
TORCH is the fetal infections, the viral infections. By this we mean the TORCH test. See, TORCH, okay, if IgM, IgG viral is positive, it can lead to a pregnancy loss in this pregnancy, right? Plus for that, you have to have avidity markers. You've really got to support it. It can lead to, but a TORCH will never ever, would not lead to a recurrent pregnancy. So TORCH is not at all useful in a patient, in a workup of a patient with recurrent pregnancy losses, because it doesn't lead to recurrent pregnancy losses. So I would not go for a TORCH investigation in a recurrent pregnancy loss if a couple walks in, but I would only go for a TORCH test if the patient is pregnant and she comes to me giving history of some contact or giving history of having a high fever with rash. That is where I would go for a TORCH test, not in a recurrent pregnancy loss case.
Okay. So in case of late recurrent pregnancy loss, what is the contribution from genetics?
In late pregnancy losses, the contribution from genetics is lesser. It has been said that in the early, I would say it is an average of 70% the chromosomals, and after 20 weeks, it becomes 12%, because most of the lethal chromosomes, chromosomal conceptuses have aborted by themselves by that time. And so the genetic component reduces. The more of the APLA, the anatomic uterine factors, and the thrombophilias, I would say, as a multifactorial kind of a thing, the endocrine factors, they all have a much higher role in the later gestation.
Okay, so MTHFR gene is seen in Asian population where is more. Is there an epigenetic advantage of this mutation, or are we more vulnerable to certain disorder?
MTHFR gene, yes, most of the studies have seen that this gene polymorphism is very rampant in the East Asians, in us, but not in the Caucasians. one epigenetic advantage that they say, what I was reading, it was that it that because our diet is mostly vegetarian, and we cook, so the folic acid levels are lower and the B12 is less. So this polymorphism somehow protects us by making those. I don't really know the details, but somehow something this polymorphism protects us against those nutrient deficiencies. Actually, the recent studies have said that even in these cases, if there is a folate deficiency is there coexistent, if B12 or if a B12 deficiency is coexistent, still the hyperhomocysteine, what I mean to say is that if one of the folic or B12 is okay and the other is less, still the homocysteine levels are not as high. So these two tend to like balance out each other. So maybe the epigenetic, this is just a theory that maybe it's because of our dietary factors and cooking habits. Maybe it's just an epigenetic advantage for, I don't know, I'm not the right person to answer this.
Okay, fair enough. DNA fragmentation is seen in all sperms in a single sample, or seen only some percentage of sperms in a given sample. And do you is sperm DNA fragmentation done anywhere in India?
DNA fragmentation is seen in a percentage of sperms from the sample, and that is the DFI index. And yeah, many labs are doing it. We are not doing it. And before sending it, you should see, like some do it on the liquefied sample, some do it on the cryopreserved sample, and you should look at the technique that they're doing it, because different techniques, different reference ranges. It is being done, and it is something which is closely related to RPL and infertility, and it's a good association. But I think we should get it into the clinics only if we have a solution, like what to do with DNA fragmentation abnormalities.
Okay. MLPA subtelomeric versus cytogenetic microarray on POC. Please elaborate.
Yes, this is very important, especially in the cost effectiveness, because most of the here are the two things that I would like to say. See, if it's a very early embryonic loss, so MLP here we are looking at large chunks being missed. Okay, so MLP, so microarray is going to like monosomy, trisomies, so that is going to be picked up by microarray as well, and MLP is subtelomere as well. But if you go towards the more subtle things, like if there is some micro deletion which is interstitial, that is going to be picked up by cytogenetic microarray and not by subtelomeric MLPA. So yes, depending upon the case scenario, the situation you have, the gestation age you have, the ultrasound features that you look at, if you have something in mind, like, okay, these ultrasound features look like it's 13q or it's 18q, then you can send for a subtelomeric MLPA. It is definitely cost effective, but then there are chances you will miss. So it is always better if you go for a cytogenetic microarray directly. Uh, yeah, but in certain, you need to correlate actually what your ultrasound findings are, what your period of gestation is. Plus, if in many cases, you might have to jump after a subtelomeric microarray, you might have to go for a cytogenetic microarray. So I think if the prices are not very different, go for a cytogenetic microarray straightforward.
Okay. So there's a particular base question. 2 RPL, no fetal polymorphism in both pregnancies, POC normal, couple karyotype normal. How do we proceed and cause?
So 2 pregnancy losses, no fetal pole in both pregnancies, POC normal microarray, couple karyotype normal. Yeah, so this is the thing, like this would have been best in a research setting if we could have undertaken whole exome, but we know that a pre-test genetic counseling is required for it, and I think we've already had, you mean that a negative RPL workup has already anatomic, endocrine, everything been ruled out. But what I would tell to this patient is that wait, if the maternal age is not increased, look at the maternal age. If she is in her 20s, early 30s, wait, because expectant management is going to give us an answer in 60 to 70% of the cases. So just wait and watch. Expectant 10 TLC that we all know, tender love care, it has given good results. I would really not, as of now, go for a bigger genetic test. I would just tell them that take your time, take it slow. there is a good outcome in 50 to 60% still.
Okay. So if PGTA report is normal, then any form of screening is suggested for anybody like NIPS, or no screening at all in this pregnancy.
This is important because PGTA is being done at many centers now in routinely in combination with IVF. So yes, many couples do come with us, and interesting. I would just like to share a case that I had. So a couple walks in, they have a PGT report, normal, NT is increased. Now, I think this question is from Mayank. He will understand that if NT is increased, we look for a chromosomal etiology, but PGTA has been done. They've been told that chromosomes are normal, but the microdeletions have not been covered, right? You need to know if PGTA report is normal, what was the method that PGTA utilized? Was it a qPCR or was it NGS? Because the resolution will depend on both. See, in that case, NIPT should not be done, because NIPT, because you've already looked at the peach chromosomes, but yes, you cannot commit about the microdeletions to the to the parents, and you should always look at what the technique has been employed in PGTA, qPCR or NGS, because the resolution differs.
Okay. Inversion in chromosome 9 can cause fertility. That's a question.
Yes, that's a very interesting thing. Inversion chromosome 9 is what we call a heteromorphism, like it's a chromosomal variant, and various studies have shown that this inversion is increased in infertile and recurrent pregnancy couples as compared to the just to the general population. But some studies say that it causes infertility, but it is not actionable. So I would say that I would like to say that it would actually not increase cause fertility, though some studies say that this is increased in those couples. That increase might just be there because those patients who have infertility or recurrent pregnancy loss have had more karyotyping done. It might be a bias, so I would not consider it to be associated with infertility. It just might be a chance bias.
Chromosomal microarray 750K or 315K in POC, which is preferred?
315, Optima, the 315 is preferred because cost effectiveness, plus you need to tell the patient, see, depending upon the, 2-3 things have to be taken in mind. If it's early pregnancy loss, nothing seen in the ultrasound, and or less than 10 weeks, better to send 315K Optima, because the cost is lesser and it will cover the targeted, the difference is that it will cover the targeted regions which are found to be recurrent anomalous in fetus, and it will give you targeted results. But if you have a fetus, more gestational age, something more anomalous on ultrasound, then you might like to go for 750K. But if whenever you are going for 750K microarray, you should tell the parents that it could lead to a WUS, variants of uncertain significance, which are lesser in Optima. So for early pregnancy losses, no cardiac activity, 8 weeks, 9 weeks, it's better to go for 315K.
What would you suggest in case of open NTD?
Open NTD is 70% multifactorial. Single gene etiology is very debatable. Chromosomal could be there. Trisomy 18 could be there if there are other ultrasonic features, and you could have a look at the dual. You could have a look at the other markers. But if it's a NTD, I think you should say that the risk of reoccurrence is 3 to 4% in the next pregnancy, periconceptional folic acid, and we are good to go. No, nothing else required.
Next question is, can you please give a look about Y chromosome microdeletion for RPL?
Y chromosome microdeletions are associated with infertility. The A, B, and C. A and B lead to azoospermia. C has some amount of sperms, but those are related with infertility, not recurrent pregnancy loss. In recurrent pregnancy loss, the male infertility we are not concerned about. So those are very important causes, the AZ, A, B, C regions, microdeletions, but for the male factor infertility, not RPL.
Okay. Recurrent blighted ovum, in such cases, should the POC CMA be sent or not?
Yes, after 2 or 3 it should be sent. See, even it could be a chance finding only, that every time you are getting aneuploid, but that chance finding could be very, very rarely due to some mitotic defect in one of the parents, or sometimes it's a elderly female, 40-year female, she's having recurrent blighted ovum because her maternal age is increased. So not only it's going to help you with establishing the etiology in this pregnancy, this is going to also help you with the next pregnancy to prognosticate the patient. So it should be sent after the second or the third time.
Okay, we have a couple of questions on NIPT, but we will keep that for another webinar. So the next one is, even after normal POC, CMA results in parental karyotype, is the parental karyotype advisable? What we had classical teachings, it is not, but any new guidelines by which you are saying that it should be done?
No. See, if it is if it depends upon the situation. Actually, it is not. If second or third, if it is a second pregnancy loss and I send POC microarray and it comes out to be something like trisomy 16, I will stop there and then, because it's one of the commonest causes of aneuploidy. And if it's a third or a fourth miscarriage, then and the previous POCs have not been sampled. So for the third or the fourth, I would like to go for it, because that this could be very rarely, in genetics everything we're talking about is rarely, very rarely it could be that this is an aneuploid loss, but the parents have a translocation, right? So after, not in the first and second, but after third or fourth POC, I think a karyotype should be done.
In normal karyotype variants like 9QH, YQH, etc., any recent literature guidelines for any further genetic workup? All non-genetic causes already ruled out?
No, these are chromosomal heteromorphisms. They are a part of our normal population variation, nothing to do. There are studies which will suggest that these are increased in cases of patients with recurrent pregnancy losses or infertility, but guidelines do not suggest that we should do anything separately for them.
Okay. 3 biochemical pregnancies, karyotyping normal, no alpha, how to proceed?
I think if the same expectant management should be told to the patient, karyotype is normal. I would like to here again stress upon it that, see, the last study that I showed, in that the whole genome sequencing, when it was done, those couples who had normal karyotype had inversions or balanced translocations. So if a normal karyotype, there might be some very little inversions or translocations which might be missed. So there might be some genetic etiology, but as of now, you cannot test for it, right? So we would advise them expectant management, and if possible for the next pregnancy, please try sending a POC that is going to shed some insight on what is actually going on, what is the genetic makeup of the product of conception. So expectant management and POC microarray testing.
If genetic mosaicism can show severe implications in RPL?
Genetic mosaicism, I think you mean germline mosaicism. Yes. What I understand from this question is that if the germline karyotype, the parental karyotype is normal, but the gonads, they might have a balanced translocation. So in those cases, the parental karyotypes, the blood karyotypes will be normal, but the POCs you might see, they suggest that this is something which is seen in balanced translocations of the parents, so that they might be carrying it in their gonads, the balanced translocation. So the implication would be that the blood karyotype will be normal, but they will have an increased risk of recurrent pregnancy losses because they have gonadal mosaicism for that.
Okay. Any experience of case with XQ'd inactivation with RPL?
No, this is, yes, but not recurrent pregnancy, early losses, late losses, like for the incontinentia pigmentide, where the male fetuses, where it is lethal in male fetuses, the mother was a carrier, and recurrent pregnancy losses in male, but it's usually not that early pregnancy losses, like we're talking here about around less than 10 weeks. So not very early, but yeah, late pregnancy losses.
MLPA subtelomeric region versus cytogenetic microarray for POC.
I think we've already answered this question.
Okay. 2 RPL all invert in INV normal, including karyotyping, followed by infertility of 2 years through infertility panel is normal.
Yes, again, as we've already answered this question. So expectant management and POC microarray is normal, but if you have another pregnancy loss, do send a microarray, because anytime it could be a chance or finding. And then wait and watch depending upon the mother's age. And expectant management is good. And still, if this reoccurs, then we have to counsel the patient around about the other options like PGTA that we have. But as of now, see, I am not stressing upon the whole exome sequencing part here, which can be done after a normal microarray. But if the couple is motivated enough for further genetic testing, a thorough, a good family history should be taken, a good pre-testing genetic counseling can be done, should be done, and then you might like to take this case up for that. But expectant management is what I would say as of now, or PGTA after if they're really in much despair due to recurrent pregnancy losses.
Low pass genome sequencing in RPL to look for balanced chromosomal rearrangement is same like that exome sequencing. Is that available anywhere?
Can I take this question?
Yeah, Dr. Shitali, please.
Yeah. So low pass genome sequencing is like we are sequencing the whole genome, so there are no targeted probes. So it has a very good pickup rate for picking up chromosomal arrangements. So it is almost equivalent like we are doing NGS plus a chromosomal microarray, but the depth is very less. So the coverage or the depth which we see for a whole exome would be almost minimum, we take it as 30x, but the ideal is like 80 to 100x depth. But in whole low pass genome sequencing, the depth is as less as 5 to 10x. So we might be missing out on more, and they're not same, right? Probably in near future, we are going to come out with this. Currently, I'm not sure which lab is doing it, but we are in the pipeline for doing this low pass genome sequencing. But as told, the clinical indications, the pickup rate, and the interpretation would be quite different from whole exome. Exome is, we are just covering the coding region. So that is, we are covering only the exomes. Whole genome is, we will be covering the whole genome, including the exons, the introns, the UTR regions, everything. So they are not same. Costing, I'm not sure still, but yes, obviously genome sequencing would be a little costlier. But if we get more samples, or if we start to look at the cost effectiveness, then it would be a better pickup rate for unknown things rather than going for known things. Whole genome, low pass genome sequencing would be better than exome sequencing.
Okay, in consanguineous couple with normal couple karyotype, POC to be sent for CMA or clinical exome, whole exome? Dr. Meenakshi?
Yes, sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, in a consanguineous couple with normal couple karyotype, POC to be sent for CMA, clinical exome, or whole exome sequencing?
First of all, microarray. POC should always be sent first for microarray, because the chromosomal causes are the bulk, and always microarray first. Not exome or whole exome first, always microarray.
And even if chromosomal microarray comes negative, in such cases it is always better and a higher pickup rate for trioexome rather than sending for clinical or whole exome. We may or we might not get anything significant unless and until we do it in conjunction with the parental testing. So once the chromosomal microarray is negative, I usually would suggest that we should go in for a trio whole exome, because there are many genes which do not have a very clear-cut phenotype, and the number of genes which are covered in the clinical exome are much less. So if you're just saying the early trimester POCs, then we don't have anything to back up on. So it is always better to send for trio whole exome in such cases.
Okay, so I think we are almost done with the questions. There are quite a few. In case you have any additional questions, you can write into us at diagnostics@medgenome.com, or give us a call at the toll-free number given there, 1-800-103-3691. And once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Meenakshi Lalla for taking time off from her schedule and giving us this very insightful talk. And as you can make out from the number of questions, there's a lot of curiosity and a lot of interest in knowing about the genetics of recurrent pregnancy loss. So hopefully we'll have another webinar on this sometime later on. But we do plan on having more webinars in the near future on reproductive genetics. So look out for them in your email inbox and register for them. And I think the next one will probably be on NIPT. So again, I'd like to thank the audience for taking time off from their schedule to attend this webinar and also, participate in with so much interest. And yes, we will definitely be sending out a recording of this webinar, and this should be done in about a week or so. So if you have any additional questions after that, you can always write into us at the email ID given below.